Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I want to start off with an apology. I know I had mentioned a number of times in the comments that I plan to do one more election night video before election day, but to paraphrase the great Dr. Ian Malcolm, life finds a way to get in the way. The election night videos are as time-consuming, frustrating, and complicated to do as they are rewarding. Circumstances and situations conspired to make this one impossible, and unfortunately, I have had to end that project. I know a number of you were waiting for it because it's by far my most popular type of video, so I am deeply sorry. I didn't want to end this year's election coverage abruptly, though, so I decided to do a half prediction, half analysis of the closing days of the election. I also have the spreadsheet's simulation results for that election night video, and seeing as how a couple of them differ from mine, I decided that I would share those with you at the end, giving the spreadsheet its simulated say. So stay tuned for that at the end. And for those of you all set to tell me that I'm an idiot and how foolish I'm going to look, I'd like to quote yet another great man, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Who's the more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows him? Speaking of following me, if you enjoy listening to me be foolish, as well as watch election analysis and election night videos, current, historical, and what ifs, then please consider subscribing. And if you enjoy this video, please hit that like button. It all really does help to grow the channel. Also, if any of you have anything you'd be interested in seeing after election day, please be sure to let me know in the comments below. As for this video, I'm going to primarily focus on the Senate and the presidential election because the House and governorships, well, it's been requested by some viewers, are pretty much set in stone with very little change, but I'll go ahead and touch on those first. On the governor's side, all but Montana is pretty much completely baked in, and honestly, I don't buy the argument that Montana is a toss-up at all, based on the single fact the GOP candidate Greg Gianforte has led every single poll taken. Not most, all of them. That gives Republicans 27 governorships to Democrats 23, a pickup of one mansion for the GOP. In the House, the safe and likely seats alone give the Democrats control of the House, making it anticlimactic. Also, polling on congressional races is difficult to wade through because there are so few of them, and the ones that are done tend to be partisan polls or internal polls from one of the campaigns. How can you tell the difference? Legitimate polls do things like call respondents rather than using computers and rotate the possible responses, starting with one candidate on one call and then starting with the other on the next. Partisan polls almost always work exclusively with the candidate of one party over the other, and internal campaign polls say things like, candidate A will raise your taxes and give it to terrorists. Who do you support in the election? Or candidate B will let companies dump toxic waste in your backyard pool. Who do you support in the election? Also known as just a wee bit biased. So perusing polls is a bit time-consuming because it requires more reading than other polls to figure out if they're legit. Still, I did it as a preparation for the election night video, and this is the map I came up with. Yes, I colored all of those in all by myself. Again, the Democrats maintain control with a net gain of about 5 seats. Republicans also gain a seat because there are 5 vacant seats going into the election, as well as a retiring libertarian that is an expected GOP pickup. For the record, all the usual suspects will retain their seats. In fact, out of the 25 or so toss-up seats, I don't see any of them changing hands this election. It's very hard to lose a House seat unless you're primaried out, there's a change in ideology in your district because of redistricting or demographic changes, or you have a scandal. But the seats that will change hands this election are so overwhelmingly going to change hands that there's no suspense to this at all. That leaves the Senate and the White House. We'll start with the Senate. We're going to start with fewer states as toss-ups than usual because the way I look at it, if you're averaging 5-point leads by now, I think I can safely project that you're probably going to win. Congressional races are always much more stable for the most part than presidential ones. What we're left with are the 7 closest races for the Senate. Some are closer than others, but these 7 will decide who controls the Senate. Maybe. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that the polling information that I'm using is through yesterday, which for me was Sunday. We'll start in Maine, where Republican incumbent Susan Collins seems to have helped herself with her Supreme Court vote. Since voting no, her poll numbers have improved, but Sarah Gideon is still ahead, even with Collins closing. Making things more difficult for Collins is Maine's ranked choice voting system, which is where voters choose not only their first options, but a follow-up choice should their candidate not win 50% of the vote. Independent candidate Lisa Savage, who is polling in the lower single digits, but around 5% the last 2 weeks, would be the candidate to go and whose support would need to be reshuffled. She has voiced support for her supporters listing Gideon as their second choice on their ballots. Gideon has led almost the entire way, and while the race is currently trending towards Collins, it doesn't look like she has enough time to both overtake Gideon and reach 50%. Democratic gain. South Carolina has been shockingly close all year. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was initially expected to cruise to victory, but being as disliked as he is in his own state, Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison pulled even quickly and stayed there. Graham has been swamped by Harrison's financial war chest, which pushed him into the lead in a number of polls to the point that Graham was begging for donations with every appearance on Fox News. But a lifeboat in the form of Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation seems to have helped Graham, who has jumped back up, making the race even again over the last 2 weeks. Graham is underperforming the president in the state, meaning Harrison will have to get crossover votes. While the president is making a point of not campaigning for Graham, a state with a voting history like South Carolina means he probably doesn't have to. Republican hold. Montana is a solidly Republican state on the presidential level, but they're not opposed to sending Democrats to the governor's mansion. Case in point, the Democratic nominee for Senate is the current governor, Steve Bullock. When he ended his presidential run and announced, he quickly took a small lead over incumbent Republican Senator Steve Daines. Since then, Daines has gone out to a small lead and then fell back into a tie between the two. While I have often talked about the possibility of ticket splitting making a comeback in this election, in a state like Montana, it's much more likely that Trump will drag Daines across the finish line. Republican hold. North Carolina came very close to being a lock for the Democrats. Then their nominee, Cal Cunningham, got stupid and became engulfed by a sexting-turned-adultery scandal. Incumbent Senator Thom Tillis rode in on that scandal like Gandalf at the Battle of Helm's Deep, but polls have continued to show a consistent, if definitely smaller, Cunningham lead. Yes, there are polls showing Tillis closing in, but most of those are partisan polls. Go back and rewatch the beginning of the video to know my opinion on those. Cunningham has the advantage as long as he can keep it in his pants for about another 36 hours. Democratic gain, that gives the Democrats 50 seats. A Biden win would clinch control of the Senate, and another win would give them outright control. But there are 3 seats to go, and all 3 are razor close, with Republican incumbents running for re-election. Iowa has been the closest Senate race of the election, but Democratic challenger Teresa Greenfield has held a small but consistent lead over incumbent Senator Joni Ernst, even when the same polls showed President Trump leading. But this weekend, Ann Seltzer, who is considered the queen of Iowa polling, released a poll showing Ernst ahead by 4 points. That made people take notice. It was the second straight poll showing Ernst ahead, although another well-respected pollster showed Greenfield ahead by about 3 points, although both polls showed the president leading. It's a dramatic last-minute turn in a state the Democrats felt good about going in and Republicans had started to give up on. But it is possible that, like Maine and South Carolina, the Supreme Court confirmation may be playing a role here. While Greenfield has been leading almost the entire year, it's clear that Ernst has closed the gap and has likely retaken the lead. Republican hold. The last 2 Senate races are in the same state, and they are doozies. They are in Georgia, which is in the rare position of having both of their Senate seats on the same ballot, thanks to the retirement of former Republican Senator Johnny Isakson. Isakson resigned for health reasons back in 2019, which created a special election for his seat. The regularly scheduled race has Republican Senator David Perdue running for re-election against Democratic nominee Jon Ossoff. The seat was initially considered a slam dunk for Perdue last year, but polling has now showed otherwise. The race has been very close between the two all year long and is the Georgia seat most likely to be affected by the close presidential campaign, or vice versa. The other race is more complicated. After Isaacson resigned, Georgia's governor has the authority to appoint a replacement until the next election. In this case, that was Brian Kemp, and he chose businesswoman Kelly Loeffler in an attempt to curry favor with desperately needed suburban women in the general election, giving them, he hoped, a leg up on keeping the seat. He did this over the strong objections of President Trump, who heavily favored Representative Dave Collins, an outspoken supporter of his in the House of Representatives. Collins almost immediately announced a run for the seat against Loeffler. Not for a primary, however. The way Georgia elections work, all declared candidates for the seat would appear on a ballot in the general election. That means Loeffler and Collins were going against each other and the Democrats. Speaking of the Democrats, they've had their own issues. 3 major candidates announced: Matt Lieberman, son of former Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, former Georgia State Senator Ed Tarver, and Reverend Raphael Warnock, pastor of the famed Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, who had another famous former pastor by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. Collins and Loeffler spent most of the summer pretending it was a two-way race, pounding the living snot out of each other for what was expected to be a Republican versus Republican runoff in January. Then something happened to the Democrats that almost never happens in these situations. They had a collective epiphany and realized one person dominating Democratic votes has a much better chance of advancing than someone with a third of one half of the pie. The beneficiary of that was Warnock. In fact, so many of them swung to him that Warnock overwhelmingly took the lead in polling over all candidates, just not over 50%, because the other 2 Democrats are polling a combined mid to high single digits. Why is that important? They only do plurality winners in Georgia on the presidential level. Remember the aforementioned runoff? The top 2 candidates, regardless of party, advance. When it was Loeffler and Collins, the Republicans were guaranteed of carrying the seat. The only question was who was going to win. While that possibility still remains, the fact Warnock is polling about 10 points over either Loeffler or Collins suggests there's a pretty good chance that he's advancing. But the odds of him getting a majority of the vote to avoid the runoff is almost impossible because there are just too many candidates. Could Warnock win outright? Sure. But short of the other 2 candidates dropping out, which isn't going to happen at this late stage, it would require Warnock get almost all the Democratic vote, a nice chunk of the independents, and maybe even some Trump-hating Republicans. But these kinds of elections almost always go to a runoff because the vote tends to be spread around too much compared to a head-to-head campaign. Warnock is advancing, which makes it a race for second place. Recent polls have shown Collins competitive again for second place with the incumbent Loeffler. Who the Democrats' preferred opponent in a runoff would be is an unknown. Collins is a bridge too far for some Republican voters because of his support for the president, and they might either cross the aisle and vote Democrat or just stay home in January. That's a big deal because turnout is vital in a runoff, even more so in one that could decide control of the Senate. Loeffler, however, has been a little bit of a scandal lightning rod during the election, with her financial scandal over a stock sale just after a pandemic briefing, as well as some controversial endorsements, and her blatantly stupid assertion that she's not familiar with the Access Hollywood tape that hounded the president at the end of the 2016 campaign. That tells Georgia voters she's either a liar or an oblivious idiot who didn't even follow the 2016 election. Neither is a good look for a sitting senator. In polls over the last week, Loeffler and Collins have split, finishing second. Either one could advance, but honestly, it doesn't matter who makes it to the runoff. Turnout in January will be king. So why didn't I name a winner for the head-to-head race? Because it might not be as much of a head-to-head race as we thought. Polling has suggested a tight, uncertain race since the end of summer, not only because the numbers between the 2 have been close, but because of an outsized number of respondents who have been voicing support for the Libertarian candidate, Shane Hazel. Hazel's support has been consistently in the 3 to 4 point range when they've been asked about him. One of the more slippery issues for any pollster has always been third-party candidates. Should they include them in the question? Do they mention them if they don't include them, but voters express support on their own? Anytime you see a poll where the respondents are 2 candidates and a combined undecided/other, that's where the other comes in. Sometimes clients want them included. Other times they specifically don't. Decisions. So what does all this have to do with Ossoff v. Purdue? As it turns out, everything. Where the four-way Rumble in the Jungle primary special election has more candidates, the other race was always being reported like a winner-take-all contest. Now the race is so close, Hazel's support, as small as it might be, isn't going down. Unlike polls where some people have to be reminded of other candidates, they'll be right there on the ballot. Usually third-party and independent candidate support drops the closer it gets to Election Day. When he's included, however, Hazel's support has been steady and might be enough to also throw that election into a January runoff. That makes the possibility that we won't know who controls the Senate until after the new Congress convenes even greater, because now we're talking about 2 seats, not 1. For either party to avoid that, they have to reach a minimum of 50 seats and have their candidate win the White House without either of Georgia's seats. The bad news for Democrats is they don't do as well historically in runoff elections as Republicans. Ossoff knows a lot about that, having won a plurality of the vote in a special election in the state's 6th congressional district back in 2017. He advanced to a runoff with about 48% of the vote, just under the majority needed to avoid the runoff. But the runner-up was Republican Karen Handel in an insane 20-candidate election, 15 of them Republicans. She finished with just under 20% of the vote. She won 52-48 in January. This does not bode well for either Democrat. In both races, the Democrats' best bet is to break 50% on Election Day. One likely won't, but the other one has a shot. Ossoff has led in all but one poll over the last week, but Hazel has consistently polled at 2-3% in those polls. If that holds, the odds either Ossoff or Perdue reaching 50% are very slim. I see both races going to a runoff, and one party will likely win both seats, making them both Republican holds, creating a 50-50 tie in the Senate, leaving control down to whomever wins the White House if this holds. If control of the Senate hangs in the balance for the runoffs, however, all bets are off, because the candidates will drown in a sea of money and the voters in a sea of ads. Now that we know that the Senate is on the line, on to the presidential race. The media likes what I like to call the Lord of the Rings narrative, one state to rule them all. They loved it in 2000 when things came down to Florida. They loved it even more in 2004 when things came down to Ohio because it was close and they still got to call a winner. Now the media is pushing the narrative that everything hinges on Pennsylvania. Part of what's feeding this is Nate Silver's 538.com has declared PA their tipping point state of 2020, which means it's the state most likely to push a candidate over 270 electoral votes. They even have a cute little snake graph showing how it works on their website. So now every media outlet is shipping 90% of their reporters to Pennsylvania to report on the pulse of the state. Every news and political website has articles about how everything comes down to PA. Let me say this as a resident of the great Keystone State. It does not come down to just Pennsylvania. Could it? Sure, technically, but also technically could come down to any state, because they're talking about the state that pushes either Trump or Biden over 270 electoral votes. It could be Wyoming if there are quick calls for the president in Texas, Florida, and North Carolina. The real narrative, which is being completely ignored because it's not easy to sum up in a box at the bottom of your TV screen, is that there is no such thing as a real tipping point state anymore. Barack Obama and Donald Trump both proved the last 3 elections we are no longer a win this state and win the election country, but a win these states country. Regions have become incredibly polarized compared to one another. Campaigns for president have become contests in regional coalition building. Obama did it by stringing the so-called blue wall together. Trump did it by winning Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. If Trump wins, it will likely be because he did the same thing again. If Biden wins, it could be because he did as well. But he also has a number of additional paths without winning Pennsylvania. If he wins Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and he's up big in all 3, all it takes is one more competitive state, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Ohio, North Carolina, as well as Pennsylvania, would give him what he needs to win if he holds all of Clinton's 2016 states. Florida and Ohio basked in the glory of being the states for close to a decade. Now it's regions, not states, no matter how little the media wants to tell you that. Now let's look at the map. Biden has a huge lead at the start with 253 electoral votes, and Trump trails with 125. However, with the exception of Nevada, which has shuffled its way back into being a toss-up over the last couple of weeks, the president won all of them back in 2016. First, I want to talk about Maine's 2nd congressional district and get that out of the way. Maine, like Nebraska, divvies its electoral votes up by congressional district. Polls have shown Biden with a small lead almost all year. But most importantly, polls also show incumbent Democratic Representative Jared Holden with roughly a 3,000-point lead, give or take. While the president pulled out the victory in 2016, Golden became the first challenger to defeat an incumbent in Maine's 2nd congressional district since 1916, over 100 years. While I may have exaggerated his lead, Golden is on track for a blowout victory in the district, which bodes well for Biden's chances. Democratic gain, which brings Biden up to 254. We're going to start with the downgraded Nevada. Now, Biden has led in the polls all year long, but over the last couple of weeks, his leads have begun to shrink, mostly due to a lack of enthusiasm for him from the state's Hispanic population, which is a place where the president has made some inroads. However, the state hasn't gone for a Republican since George W. Bush back in 2004, and Clinton did win the state by 2.5 points. Biden has been polling better than Clinton, and while his average lead has slid, he is still led in every poll since early November, and all but 2 since last year. One of those was a tie. Democratic hold. My rant about Pennsylvania's coverage aside, the state has seen a tightening of the race there. Biden led, sometimes by double digits, all summer long and well into the fall. But over the last couple of weeks, the president's campaign there has shown some signs of life. But out of 30 polls over the last week, 30 of them, Biden has led in 29. His average lead has dropped, and there have been reports of low turnout in Philadelphia, as well as a number of other high black population areas in the state. But Biden is still pulling in leads of about 5 points. It's the occasional lead of the president that puts it below that 5-point average. Democratic gain, which gives Biden 280 electoral votes and enough to win the White House. Let's quickly go over the remaining states. North Carolina has also consistently shown Biden ahead. With Cunningham leading by even more, it would take some major ticket splitting for Biden to blow that lead. Democratic gain. Arizona has seen some tightening. In fact, polls yesterday were starting to show it really close. But Biden has still consistently been in the lead, other than the occasional Trump lead. Much like North Carolina, Democratic Senate nominee Mark Kelly has been way ahead in the polls, and I don't think there will be enough vote splitting to make up that difference. Democratic gain. Ohio was a state the president won pretty handily, but it's decided to go back to its roots as a swing state. That said, Biden started taking the lead late summer and early fall, but polls showed the president back out in front, but very, very smallly. Although his leads have only been of the 1- and 2-point variety, he's led in 7 of the last 8 polls released. It looks like Ohio is going to break its streak of voting for the winner. Republican hold. Like its Senate race, Iowa has been very close for much of the year in the presidential race, but the president has done better in the state than he has in other states where the Democratic Senate candidate has led most of the way. Now, polling suggests a surge for Ernst and for Trump. It may still be a squeaker, but the trend line is now favoring the GOP on all levels. Republican hold. Texas has been surprisingly close all year long. Democrats have been hoping to turn it purple for some time, and it's definitely competitive this year. But the president has led most of the way, even if by only a little bit. If Biden wins Texas, it'll be clear that it's a landslide long before election night is over. But the numbers right now favor Trump heading into Election Day. Republican hold. Georgia is a bit crazy this year. Like Texas, it's been shockingly close considering the state's voting history. Trump led much of the year, but Biden began making a push in the summer. Things have gone back and forth ever since, but of late, Biden has led more than the president. In fact, he's led in 8 of 13 polls over the last week, leads that coincide with the late surge by the Democratic Senate candidates. Unlike the state candidates, the presidential race doesn't require a majority of the vote to win, as Bill Clinton, the last Democrat to win the state, did so with only a plurality of the vote in 1992's three-way election. This gives Biden an edge, since turnout to help get the Democratic Senate candidates over 50% increases Biden's chance of eking out even a plurality victory in the state. Democratic gain. Lastly, Florida. Florida and Georgia are the two states I am least comfortable in my predictions because they are ridiculously close in the polls. That said, in my last Electoral College status, I pointed out the trend line did favor the president and predicted if he kept it going, he would take the lead. It did, and he has in polling. They've split the polling, but recently it's favored the president more, and he's still trending upwards. That combined with reports that voting in Democratic-dominated South Florida is underperforming is a bad sign for Biden. He can make some of it up in my old stomping grounds of the I-4 corridor, which has been the swing area of the state for some time, but honestly trends Democrat in recent elections. But there is only just so much that can be made up there. Republican hold. That brings us to 322 electoral votes for Biden and 216 for Trump. A much closer result than you may have expected. This is why you should always wait until the last minute to make a prediction. There is always a state or a race somewhere that has a candidate surging at the last minute. In this case, I don't believe it's enough to overtake the huge leads that Biden has built up over the summer and the early fall. Also, if historical data shows us anything, it's that even if polls are wrong, there is one constant. Undecideds break for the challenger at a rate of 4-1. Every election, this happens like clockwork. It usually just isn't enough to make up the difference. And that's the case here. There just aren't enough undecided voters for the president, even if he was the challenger, to be able to make it up. This victory would also break the tie in the Senate, giving Democrats control over both houses of Congress, but not a mandate, which would make passing major legislation difficult, although that would be the case for either party in a 50-50 Senate. What this map also shows is how the president could pull out a victory. Georgia, Arizona, and North Carolina are close enough that they could go either way, and pulling out Pennsylvania would be enough to give Trump a second term, although admittedly, it would likely be a big popular vote defeat since all four would be close, as well as Texas and Florida, meaning Biden would dominate the other high population states like California, New York, and Illinois with landslide victories. Usually states like Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina help make up the difference for a Republican candidate. That's not going to be the case this time. All three states are close. One thing is clear. It is much more likely that the president is going to win with 270 to maybe 280 electoral votes than it would be a blowout, while it's much more likely that a Biden win is going to be somewhere north of 300 electoral votes. As promised, here's a look at the simulations results, which, as you can see, is slightly different. It presents results that were a little more favorable to the Democrats. The simulation has one of Georgia's two seats going to the Democrats, with John Ossoff winning on Election Day with 50.2% of the vote. It had 50.5% going to the Democrats in the special election, but had Warnock with only 46.1% of the vote and Loeffler with 25%, both advancing to the runoff. Here is where the state's voting history has an impact, as Loeffler won re-election in the runoff 52-48, as historical runoff turnout issues for the Democrats lowered the percentage of return voters. It also showed a rare ticket splitting in Iowa, with Greenfield and Trump each winning by less than 1%. That gave the Democrats a 52-48 lead and control of the Senate. For the presidency, there was only one difference, and that was the state of Florida, as Biden pulled out a 1% victory there, giving him 531 electoral votes to 187 for Donald Trump. Basically, the simulation is more bullish on the Democrats' polling numbers than I am. We'll see who's right or whether we're both wrong. And that's it for election 2020. It's been a hell of a journey for me and for the channel. I was convinced I'd be showing videos just to my friends and family here on YouTube, so the fact that so many of you have subscribed is amazing to me. I look forward to keeping the channel going and seeing it grow in the years to come. I always intended this to be a test run for 2022 and 2024 anyway, so to have this much success this quickly is incredible. Thanks for joining me this campaign, and I'll see you on the other side of Election Day to begin 2022 and so much more. Thanks for watching, and remember, vote.